Good morning and welcome to Words That Matter, a modern day book club. And I'm your host, Lee Smith. We have a very exciting show this morning. Someone I've really been looking forward to speaking to for a long time, and I'm very grateful to have the chance to speak with him and to share the conversation with all of you for tuning in. And we're here to speak about, among other things, his new book. And the title of that new book is Masters of Corruption: How the Federal Bureaucracy Sabotaged the Trump Presidency. And the author is, our great guest today, is Mark Moyar. Mark, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Yeah, it's great to be with you today, Lee.
It's not just one story you tell in the book. You have a personal story at the core of the book. You're talking about how the bureaucracy fought against Donald Trump, but it's also a story which starts right off in the beginning about how the bureaucracy fought you. Can you explain what happened?
Yeah, so I joined U.S. Agency for International Development as a Trump appointee in 2018, and I had written extensively on development and national security policy and thought I was going to be spending most of my time implementing policies, but I soon found out as I got put in charge of this office that there was corruption endemic and toxic leadership and other difficulties. And so I went to the agency authorities and reported this and asked them what to do. And they said, well, glad you came to us because most people here just look the other way because they don't want to get into trouble or ruffle feathers. And to me, that seemed rather cowardly and what I wasn't here to do. So I ended up reporting the corruption and did get somebody pushed out of the agency for criminal conflict of interest. But in the process, the bureaucracy itself turned against me, and I ended up getting fired and having my security clearance suspended. And I've spent the next 5 years trying to restore my security clearance and my reputation, and it's still an ongoing struggle.
You're still in the middle of it. Okay. You have a fantastic academic career, and you speak a little bit about in the book that it's not so easy as a conservative to have an academic career. But right now you're at Hillsdale. You've taught before. You went to Harvard. You went to the University of Cambridge. So you're at Hillsdale right now, and this problem is still plaguing you there?
Yes, well, and Hillsdale's great, and I don't spend too much of my time thinking about it, but I have an ongoing lawsuit against the government because what they did to me was they accused me of publishing classified information, and they did it on the basis of an anonymous military officer. And so there are rules and laws and constitutional amendments that say if you're going to try to do that to somebody, you have the right under the Sixth Amendment to know who your accuser is, and under the Fifth Amendment, due process, which means you get to see whatever you're being accused of. But the bureaucracy has come up with all sorts of convoluted reasons and excuses. So 5 years later, they still won't tell me who accused me or what I was accused of that led to my firing. And so I've sued them in federal court, and that's been dragging on for a while. But we're suing them to basically force them to comply with their own rules that say they're supposed to give us this information.
Well, one of the things, and correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things that struck me when I was reading it was the guy who's interviewing you. He wasn't able to produce any evidence, and there was no evidence. And you said, well, what's the evidence that I leaked classified information? And the guy sheepishly, or not sheepishly, had to admit, yeah, good point. There's not really any evidence. How is that possible? Or am I misreading this? That there was some secret evidence that they're using?
Yeah, well, it's it's based on this book that I've written, and this is another part of the story. There's a book called Oppose Any Foe in 2017, and I had signed a 30-day non-disclosure agreement with the government that gave them 30 days to review it. And after the 30 days, they said, well, we're busy and we need more time. And so I gave them more time. But there's also the Supreme Court had ruled if you're going to try to censor people, you have to give them a limited time period. So eventually, after many, many more months, and they had a whole year to review it, never complained. And it's only 2 years later then they come back, and this anonymous general accuses me of that says there's classified
Mm.
information in the book. So, and then this again gets into some of the just craziness of the bureaucracy. The lawyer who was sort of instigating the firing, he came back and said, after the conversation you mentioned, where there's no evidence, he said, well, this allegation came from another federal agency, and because it did, we have to accept it as gospel. We don't need to actually see the supporting evidence, which is
Wow. Right.
crazy. And that's how they argued it and got away with it. And since then, they've come up with other rationale as to why I can't see it. And a lot of it is they've said, well, one agency holds it, we can't give it to you. And then the other agency says, well, no, those guys own it. And so there's a big shell game that goes on.
I mean, it's bizarre, right? Because one of the things that we learned during the Trump administration, I mean, people who have many years in those bureaucracies understand it, but I think that for most people outside it, like myself, was this your first time in government at USAID?
It was my first time as a political appointee. I
Okay.
worked in the Department of Defense as a
Ah,
taught there and as a contractor, but I had not been a political
right.
appointee before.
Well, did you have a sense beforehand when you were previously in government about how the classification system is used as a weapon? First, it's used to shield information, then it's used to target people, and of course, most famously now, the classification system is being used at the center of a court case, federal court case in Florida against the 45th president of the United States. Are you surprised that classifications are used in this manner?
I'm somewhat surprised. I'd seen an earlier experience that if it's handled reasonably, people approach it from a reasonable perspective, it's okay. But when you have malign actors who are trying to advance some kind of agenda, I guess we shouldn't be too surprised. And we've certainly seen that. And there were also a couple other cases involving Trump appointees where basically the same thing happened is somebody suddenly accuses this person of disclosing classified information, and then the government though refuses to turn over the information. And what sometimes do, and what I think they can try to do to me is say, well, you cited something that was published in the Washington Post, which according to the court says I can publish it, but somehow some bureaucrat somewhere claims, oh, well, I don't think that's been declassified, so we're going to come after you. And as you've seen through all your research, there are many petty offenses that you can go after somebody for, but they're selectively enforced. So when Biden appointees do something, nobody pays attention. But for something even much more trivial than what the Biden people have done, they will go after you.
Well, I mean, we've just seen recent news. Biden's now suspended Iran envoy Robert Malley. And there was a letter from, I believe it was House members. And the idea is that Malley had classified information that he transferred to either his phone or his private email, which is somewhat shocking, especially given the file that he was working on, the Iran file, and then basically putting it into public by putting it on his phone or email server. Yes. So the classification system is very, it doesn't go after everyone in the same way. Not everyone's protecting it in the same way.
Yeah, and I mean the most egregious example I think is Jake Sullivan, who we know was involved in putting classified emails on Hillary Clinton's private email server, and yet when he is appointed, the press is mute on it. And there'd been some talk earlier, oh, there's no way Sullivan's going to get a security clearance, but lo and behold, he shows up, he's got a security clearance. Another egregious case is Colin Kahl, who was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and he was accused by Republicans of posting classified information on Twitter, and but he doesn't get punished either. But these same people again, they came after me and Katie Arrington, Michael Ellis, Adam Lovinger, all Republicans.
Right. I noticed that you mentioned Adam in the beginning of the book, which is great. He's a great guy, and of course, he's really been, for the thanks he got for revealing the corruption at his shop at DOD was punishment as well. I know it's strange, but were you surprised that they turned on you? It's like, hey, I thought that we want to run this thing correctly. We want to run it for the American people. Were you surprised that they turned on you? And when did people say, what did you think was going to happen? These bureaucracies protect their own. Of course, they were going to come after you.
Yeah, I do think I put a little too much faith in the bureaucracy. I'd spent more
Yeah.
time around the Department of Defense, and I will say, I worked with Marines and
Yeah.
Special Operations Forces, and those, I mean, you do have, the occasional bad apple, but you also have a lot of conscientious people who were there to serve their
Yeah.
country, and you do have people like that in the civilian bureaucracy, but you also, have more people than I expected who basically are in it for themselves and in it for the bureaucracy. And now, of course, if you go back in history, this is not a new problem. I mean, Andrew Jackson talked about how people in government end up viewing this as something to serve themselves rather than the people's interest. But this is where political appointees are so important, is that they are supposed to be making sure that the bureaucracy is doing what it's supposed to. And sometimes that happened, but sometimes, unfortunately, it didn't. And we had, in my case, part of the problem for me was that there was a senior political appointee who ended up siding with the bureaucrats, who also herself had a criminal conflict of interest. So the big challenge for the next administration is to get people who are really committed to serving the American people.
What are the other instruments that the bureaucracies used against Donald Trump and Donald Trump aides during his term?
Yeah, so security clearance is a big one.
Hmm.
Another instrument that I also deal with a lot is the inspector general. So the
Ah.
inspector generals are supposed to be these safeguards of ethics in government. But what I learned the hard way, and Adam Lovinger also learned this, is that oftentimes these inspector generals are in bed with the senior career bureaucrats, and so will cover for them. So you saw, typically in these retaliation cases, that's who you turn to. But I turned to them, and they were totally unhelpful. I
Hmm.
mean, Senator Grassley of Iowa ends up blasting the inspector general for what a sham they did. In my case, Adam Lovinger went to the Department of Defense inspector general. We had also the inspector generals at a number of other agencies, State Department, who were actively interfering. Not until late in his administration did Trump decide to fire some of these inspector generals. And I think, if he's reelected, that certainly will be priority to make sure that you don't have these malign actors who are in the position of watching the watchers.
I want to I ask this question of basically anytime I get to speak with someone about what we've come to call the deep state. If this permanent bureaucracy uh, has been around that long and people have recognized the problems with it that long, why did it why did it leap into action during the Donald Trump presidency? And I don't mean to I'm not trying to set a trap for you, because I've been coming more and more to the opinion that maybe there's something else that, in addition to the deep state, right? What catalyzed it during the Donald Trump years? So do you have any? I mean, you were there. Do you have some insight into that?
Yeah. Well, first I will say, yeah, this problem of bureaucrats out of control certainly predates Donald Trump, and we've seen it. Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, especially, were furious about how the resistance they got, but it did reach a new level with Donald Trump for a few reasons. I think one is that he was so unpopular with the career bureaucrats. 95% of all contributions from federal employees in 2016 go to the Democratic Party. You also see, I think, collusion between bureaucrats and the media
Right.
moving up to a new level. And I know in the case of Crossfire Hurricane, we saw that the idea that we have any nonpartisan media left, especially in the mainstream media, I think has been further discredited. And you have we've also seen, I think, some of the country moving further to the left in terms of the intelligentsia. And I blame a lot of this on our colleges, because they have been taken over by radicals in the last 50 years. And so things that used to be just sort of the far left, academic loony left, have now come to the mainstream, in things like DEI and transgenderism, for example. And so, some of these people, I think they've lost touch with one of our fundamental premises, that we should assume a certain degree of humility. We should assume maybe we're not right about everything. And they're convinced, no, they are infallible, and therefore anything they do can be justified.
We have to take a quick break. People are watching on YouTube, and God bless them. But we're making the jump over to Epoch TV exclusively. We're only going to be away for less than a minute, so make sure you make the jump. When we come back, Mark has a really moving section in this book where he talks about. We were just talking about how talking about limits to our knowledge, limits to what we know, limits to our ambitions. And Mark has this really moving section in this book, his new book, Masters of Corruption: How the Federal Bureaucracy Sabotaged the Trump Presidency. And you may or may not be surprised to find out one of the sources of the great Mark Moyar's conservatism. So that's what I'm going to get him to talk about right after the break. So make sure you make the jump with us. We'll see you in less than a minute. What is next-gen Marxism?
The original Marxism was really focused on the worker as being the oppressed class who would rise up in a revolution and destroy the bourgeoisie, the oppressor. But that has changed. Today, the oppressor is basically whites and anybody they consider white adjacent. So it's Jewish people, it's many Asian people, but it's, primarily white people. And I should say anybody sort of who might be considered a colonizer. That's become a very big thing in these recent weeks on the campuses. And the oppressed are any minority group, whether, based on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender concepts, or, minority groups internationally, like a smaller group that people may argue have been colonized. So that's the new next-gen Marxism.
Because they believe in this deeply, they have put the Israeli and ergo all the Jews in the category of oppressor, and they have put the Palestinian in the category of the oppressed. And once you're in the category of the oppressed, that justifies all manner of action, that justifies all acts of cruelty.
This is a book that matters. Next-gen Marxism, what it is and how to combat it. Mike Gonzalez and Catherine Cornell Gorka, these are our guests today. Make the jump with us to Epoch TV exclusively.